Gerald and Charlene Gallego weren't just lovers, they were predators. A match made in hell. Hunting together, they turned their twisted fantasies into a reign of terror that left 10 innocent victims in their wake. What they did was not only unthinkable, but also too nauseating to discuss. But what did they actually do? What kind of monstrosity drove them to do this? Who were they inside? Keep watching till the end if you dare, because this episode is no joke. At a point, you might want to unsee this. July 17, 1946. Little did the people in Sacramento, California know that one of the most notorious men in history was born on that day. A man who would terrorize the American West in the late 1970s in the most unimaginable way. From the very beginning, Gerald's life was a disaster. His mother was a prostitute and his father, Gerard Alberto Gallego. He was also a criminal who became the first man ever executed in Mississippi's gas chamber for killing a policeman during a prison break. No wonder he had a disturbing beginning of life. His mother had a string of boyfriends who used to beat him up, and some of her clients also took advantage of him. On the other side, the poor kid, Gerald Armand, was constantly begging for a hug and usually went to bed dirty and hungry. By the time he was only 10, he was already in trouble with the police for burglarizing a neighbor's house. That was merely the start of his criminal ways. He totaled 23 arrests and served some time for robbery before things began to get horribly dark. When he was 12 years old, he did something awful and sexually assaulted a 6-year-old girl, which got him sent to a youth center. And as a grown-up, he proceeded to molest his own daughter and one of her friends. Naturally, he was a born predator, and believe it or not, he got married a whopping 7 times. He was still married to one wife when he married Charlene. But who was this woman, Charlene? Born on October 10, 1956 in Stockton, California, she had a fairly decent upbringing, contrary to Gerald Armand. In fact, her father was a big shot, a vice president at a supermarket company, and her parents were kind. Then how did life bring her to the same page as Gerald? Basically, everything went awry when her mother was in a serious car accident. Charlene was forced to step in and assist, and she began accompanying her dad on business trips, where individuals would go on and on about how intelligent and eloquent she was. But then as she entered adulthood, she got involved with the wrong people, began using drugs and alcohol, and her life went out of control. At the workplace, she was notorious for being too flirtatious, and people even began referring to her as a nymphomaniac. She married a wealthy man who was addicted to heroin, and things got ugly. He assumed she was interested in threesomes, which didn't work out well for their marriage, and they broke up because her parents were too intrusive for his taste. Then her second husband was a soldier, but she grew tired of him as well, and when she proposed having a little excitement with another man's wife, that affair cooled off in a hurry. After that breakup, she reached an all-time low and even tried to kill herself. But fortunately, she came out alive. And soon after that, she met Gerald, and what happened next? Trust me, you are not ready for it. September 10th, 1977. That was the day Charlene first met Gerald at a poker club in Sacramento, California. It was one of those automatic connections, you know. In a span of a week, she was already living with him. Now, their relationship wasn't anything like the norm. Charlene adopted this submissive position, and they experimented with some quite heavy material. She detested the pain, but Gerald lived for the rough stuff, particularly when it came to their lovemaking. He had this macho aura that Charlene could not but find irresistibly attractive, and soon she was getting involved in his crazy fantasies. A few months into live-in, Gerald decided to mix things up by bringing home an exotic dancer who was 16 years old. They had a threesome, but Gerald was quite controlling about it. He ensured the dancer touched him and Charlene alone, but when he returned home from work one afternoon, he was greeted by something unexpected: Charlene and the teenager making out without him. He couldn't stand the sight. He threw the dancer out of the window and then vented his anger on Charlene, punching her around. After that, he claimed he had lost his libido and didn't want to sleep with her anymore. Charlene started to think he was having sexual affair with his customers at the bar where he worked, since he seemed so disinterested in her. Then about a year later, he dropped a bombshell. He needed a couple of sex slaves to keep things exciting. And guess what? He told Charlene to look for them, and she complied immediately. And that's how their journey of horror started. The first one's theory got was a female named Sandra K. Butler. Again, she was only 16 and was last heard from on June 26, 1978, in Sparks, Nevada. She was on her way to the Greenbrae Shopping Center, directly opposite her family's apartment, and then disappeared with a puff. Everyone at the time thought that she had run away, so the police did not really get to work looking for her. But here is the twist. People think that Sandra was indeed the initial victim of Charlene and Gerald. When she went missing, her mother had allowed her to ride her bike to the rodeo in the Washoe County Fairgrounds, and Gerald and Charlene were there as well. But the police never so much as bothered to ask them anything about Sandra's disappearance. They never confessed or were ever charged with it, and up to this day, Sandra's body has never been discovered. So no one knows what actually happened to her. Just a year after that, on June 24, 1979, the Gallegos struck once more, kidnapping 2 teenage girls from the very same fairgrounds where Sandra was riding her bike. It's a chilling connection that still sends shivers down your spine. It all started on September 10, 1978, when 2 teenagers, Kippy Vaught, who was 16, and Rhonda Schaefer, just 1 year older at 17, went out to visit the Country Club Plaza Mall in Sacramento. They were just doing what teenagers do, shopping and having a good time, when they crossed paths with this couple, Charlene and Gerald. Charlene somehow managed to lure the girls to the back of their van, and that's when everything went horribly wrong. Gerald pulled out a gun and threatened them, and just like that, the girls were trapped. They had a frightening night in Baxter, California, when Gerald attacked them repeatedly. The next day got even worse. They went out to Slough House, and Gerald forced the girls to exit the van. He compelled them to walk across a field to a ditch, and then suddenly he began beating Kippy with a tire iron. Rhonda was not safe either. He turned on her as well. Then, in a horrific twist, he took out a .25 caliber gun and shot each of the girls in the head. But Kippy, she was still breathing barely. She even tried to run away, but Gerald wasn't finished, and he returned and shot her 3 more times. And afterwards, Charlene would gloat about how excited she was during all of this, which is quite more than disturbing. After this, they got more reckless, because they just got pro at this. June 24, 1979, and they got another prey for them. This time around, it's 14-year-old Brenda Judd and 13-year-old friend Sandra Colley. They were at the Washoe County Fair in Reno, Nevada, when they became friends with Charlene and Gerald. They talked the girls into getting into their van for earning some money by distributing flyers. But instead of having a good day, they wound up on a bad ride down Interstate 80, where Gerald used them in the back of the van as Charlene drove. They wound up in this out-of-the-way place known as Humboldt Sink, and for hours Gerald just sat back and let Charlene make the girls do horrible things to one another. And then suddenly he picked up a shovel that was lying underneath the seat and pulled Sandra out of the van. He approached her from behind and struck her in the head with his shovel. The creepier part? Charlene later said how the sound she heard it made was that of a loud splat like a flat rock hitting mud. And this was when Sandra ended up on the ground. After murdering Brenda as well, Gerald dug a hole, threw their bodies inside, and covered them with stones. For 4 years, the girls were officially reported as runaways, and it was not until 1982 when Charlene finally admitted to what they had done during a trial. But it wasn't until 1999 that their bodies were discovered by a tractor driver. Anyway, after that 1979 case, they again came to work in April of 1980. It was one of those mornings that Gerald awoke and, with no warning at all, woke Charlene up, insisting, "I want a girl! Get up!" Truly an extremely horrific and creepy request to make, but our request to you is nothing like that. Just don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you really like this true crime story, and subscribe to this channel because that's what keeps us going. Anyway, back to the story. Driving around for a little while, they saw 2 teenage girls, Stacey Redican and Karen Chipman Twiggs, just leaving a bookstore. They were both 17 and likely just having their day, when Charlene, acting all nice, came over to them and mentioned that she wanted to get high on some weed. The girls, who thought everything was a joke, agreed to get into the van with her. But it quickly turned into a nightmare as soon as they were inside. Gerald greeted them at the rear of the van holding a .357 Magnum. He did not waste any time ordering Charlene to drive and forcing the girls to strip naked. What followed was a nightmare as he took turns assaulting them. Once he was finished, he made Charlene drive them to a remote area. He forced the girls into the woods one at a time, holding a hammer and a shovel. He even forced Charlene to look at the graves he had dug. She said she saw some movement, but Gerald simply dismissed it, saying the girls were dead. And then they left bearing one dead and one half-alive girl, as if it were just another day. Just 3 months later, on July 27th, a couple of picnickers found the bodies of Karen and Stacey. Bekasui, was a shallow grave some 20 miles outside Lovelock, Nevada, and all mutilated by coyotes. Anybody can guess how horrific and gruesome find it was. Both girls had been raped and had their heads bludgeoned with a blunt instrument. While this was happening, at the same time, there was another woman, Linda Teresa Aguilar, became a victim of this nightmare on June 6, 1980, when she was hitchhiking in Port Orford, Oregon. She was only 21 and 4 months pregnant when she hopped into Gerald and Charlene's car. It turned fatal when Gerald produced that same .357 revolver while Charlene was driving. Linda's family had reported her missing just 15 days later, and unfortunately, her body was discovered only 2 days later. She had been tied up with nylon cord, and the poor girl had a fractured skull. Even more horrifying was the fact that she may have been buried alive, as they discovered sand in her mouth and throat. And then there was Virginia Mochel, a 31-year-old bartender who was abducted from the parking lot of a tavern in West Sacramento on July 17, 1980. Gerald and Charlene were familiar with her. She had served them a drink or two previously. It was a known face turned into a horror. Gerald attacked her and forced her to beg for her life before strangling her. He had disposed of her body near a pond, and it was only after 3 months that her skeletal remains were discovered, still tied with fishing line. The coils of cord around her neck spoke the sad tale of how she had met her death. Then on November 1, 1980, Craig Miller, 22, and his fiancée, Mary Elizabeth Sowers, 21, were walking home from a fraternity party. They were simply standing along the roadside when they were noticed by Gerald and Charlene Gallego. Gerald showed from the car, a .25 caliber Beretta in his hand, and abducted the young couple into their car. The Gallegos took them to a secluded area. There, Gerald forced Craig outside the car and pulled the trigger, a shot to the back of his head. His corpse would later be discovered near Bass Lake, California. With Craig out of the picture, the couple returned to their apartment. What then ensued was sheer horror. Gerald led Mary into the bedroom and raped her for hours with Charlene as a witness. The next day, they went for a ride in a rural part of Placer County. There, once they arrived, Gerald threw Mary out of the car and shot her 3 times at point-blank range, abandoning her body as if she meant nothing. But what the Gallegos were unaware of was that one of the witnesses had seen the entire abduction occur, a friend of Craig and Mary. He provided the police with the car's license plate number, and that later resulted in the arrest of Gerald and Charlene at a Western Union store. When the trial began, both pleaded not guilty to murder and kidnapping, but Charlene played her cards right. Her attorneys were able to make a deal. She testified against Gerald in return for a lighter sentence of 16 years and 8 months. Gerald was not as fortunate. In 1983, California condemned him to death for murdering Craig and Mary. 1 year later, Nevada found him guilty of killing Karen Twiggs and Stacey Redican, another death sentence. But in 1997, that Nevada sentence was overturned. Charlene left prison in July 1997, having served her time. While in prison, she delved into psychology, business, and even Icelandic literature, trying to rewrite her narrative. In an interview, she referred to herself as a victim as well, stating, "There were victims who died, and there were victims who lived. I'm one of the ones who lived." She even said she tried to rescue some of the girls, though not everyone accepted that narrative. But as for Gerald, he never reached the execution chamber. Cancer took him in 2002 while he was still on death row in Nevada. However, here is one interesting part. When someone kills just 1 or 2 person with a motive, it's a simple case. But when someone becomes compulsive like this and commits such heinous things, that's moved darker and complex. Why did he actually do all these? The answer is both shocking and disturbing. It all came from his father, Gerald Albert Gallego. It's one of those cases where the sins of the father don't simply haunt the son. They mold him, turn him into something even more sinister. If you really want to get inside their heads, you've got to look past the crimes and into what was going on beneath the surface. The unseen forces working between father and son. The father, Gerald Albert, was your typical old-fashioned outlaw, a professional criminal who existed on instinct. He wasn't some mean-spirited, calculated monster. He was raw animal instinct, all anger and greed, striking out whenever something crossed him. He stumbled through life like a wrecking ball, crashing into people, using violence to force control. And even though he was rarely present, that harsh image of manhood was forced into his son's mind from day one. But the twist, the father's absence hurt more than his presence could ever possibly do. He died on death row at San Quentin when his son was still just a young boy, but that only made him bigger than life. It's as if he became this ghost looming over his son's entire existence. The kind of father you can never live up to or get away from. From a psychoanalytic view, the father is a symbol, an unreachable figure of authority that the son spends his whole life trying to become or destroy. The insane thing is the way the son's darkness developed. The father acted in the moment, survival mode, flashes of violence, but the son, he was patient, he plotted, he made it hurt as part of the process. Where his dad's violence was random and out of control, the younger Gallego made it cold, calculated, almost ritualistic. Each victim was chosen personally, each act a means of asserting he was stronger, tougher, and more dominant than the father who abandoned him. It's the sort of thing that makes you question how much of what we are is truly our own, and how much is merely the burden of the shadows we were raised under. But one thing's for sure, in this case, the sins of the father didn't just haunt the son. They grew inside him, mutated, and became something even more terrifying. But what about Charlene? Why did she join him? Everyone wants to depict her as just another victim caught up in Gerald's trap. But the reality? Surely Gerald Armand was the one calling the shots, but she wasn't some helpless observer. She played her role, and it involved more than being afraid of him. Don't forget that she was a smart woman from a middle-class home. But she had her own demons. Low self-esteem, a history of bad relationships, this deep, aching need to belong to someone. Gerald saw that weakness and used it, made her feel wanted, and gave her a role. But at some point, fear alone doesn't explain it. She wasn't merely going along with it, she was a participant in the hunt, drawing in victims, playing her own sick part in his game. It's what psychologists refer to as folie à deux, a shared madness. She wasn't just dominated by him, she nurtured his illness in herself and made it hers. It's as if she gained strength from surrendering to him, being part of his darkness. Perhaps she believed that was the only way she'd ever be significant to someone. But when it all came crashing down, she played along, played the victim. Her story is simply a reminder of how the lines get blurred when love, control, and violence become all mixed up. She and Gerald weren't merely co-conspirators. They were tied together by something far more dark and dangerous, the sort of desperate need that drives people to cross every moral boundary without looking back. What do you think about them and their motive? Share your thoughts in the comment section. And instead of such a violent massacre, if you want some extremely mysterious detective case where a haunting murder case got solved by text messages, don't miss this next video. Subscribe to the channel for more true crime cases. See you soon.